Well, hello, everybody. Today I've got with me Professor Colin Tyler, who is a founder and lead researcher at the Centre for Idealism and New Liberalism. We've got lots to talk about, as you'll see. He basically researches the British Idealists, among other idealists, and their ethical and political views, as do many members of the group. When I looked into the material, I saw there was just too much for us to really get to grips with. So we're going to limit our attention today to three of the kind of early thinkers of the movement, T.H. Green, F.H. Bradley, and Bernard Bosanquet. Is it Bosanquet or Bosanquet? I'm not sure. I'll find out.
A matter of debate.
Matter of debate. There we go. I've heard both. So we'll find out about their views anyway, and then maybe in later sessions we'll talk about some of the other thinkers. So thank you very much for joining me today, Professor Tyler. So I just want to kick things off with this question a little bit about the name of your group. So you've got, on the one hand, it's the Centre for Idealism, which is a metaphysical position that many of the people listening will be familiar with, although do let us know what that is. And then New Liberalism is a political sort of set of ideas. So how is it that the metaphysics of idealism and the political views of New Liberalism are kind of related? And why is there a group that's sort of studying what at least seem to be different kinds of ideas?
Right. Thanks very much, Nathan. No. So, yeah, it's a good question. I think what we can say is that the metaphysical philosophy of many of these people was always guided by questions around ethics and questions around politics. There are some who are more narrowly focused on metaphysics and logic and so on, and Bradley is certainly one of those. You get other people who are, to my mind at least, much more concerned with the ethics and politics, and that would be somebody like Green. I know we're going to be talking about whether he has a metaphysics or not. But then there are people in the middle, and the people in the middle include Bosanquet. So actually the choice of the three thinkers here is useful in this regard. There is always some element of non-metaphysical meaning of idealism in each of their thought. Primarily, it's around the idea that politics should be guided by ethical considerations. And in that sense, it's often seen in the pejorative sense of idealism, of being idealistic, in that pejorative sense, the non-philosophical sense. And the problem with that, I think, is, as a characterization of the British Idealists, is that does tend to imply that they ignore important things around power, and that they think that if we're just all nice to each other, then everything will come right. What they are very concerned about, and this is across the board, particularly for those who write about politics. Bradley doesn't really write about politics, he writes about punishment, but not about politics. But people who do write about it within the British Idealist movement, like T.H. Green, Bernard Bosanquet, David Ritchie, Sir Henry Jones, Edward Caird, these people are also concerned with the power and asymmetries in their cultures. So there are philosophical reasons why we call them idealists, and we'll talk about some of that, but there are also political reasons why they, as a group, adopt a position that one might think of as being idealistic, and that this is not least around the fact that ethics has to be at the heart of the politics. The new liberal element is a political category. It's a political category in the United Kingdom, particularly in the Edwardian period and leading up to 1916, when David Lloyd George takes over, and it stops being quite new liberal in the way that it had been previously. And the new liberals politically focus on two particular prime ministers in the UK. One is Sir Henry Campbell Bannerman, and the other is Herbert Asquith. And they are new liberal prime ministers, and their administrations, which did include people like Lloyd George, are behind setting up things like they introduced the first old age pensions. They set up some basic welfare reform. Everybody focuses on the Labour 1945 government for good reason, but there is actually a movement in that direction. And importantly, the New Liberals who are in government in the early part of the 20th century are reading Green. They're reading L.T. Hobhouse, Leonard Trelawney Hobhouse, who himself was a great student of Green, although rejected the metaphysics, rejected the idealism side in the philosophical sense. But Asquith as well was a student and later a fellow of Balliol at the same time as Green. So they did know one another, and also people like Edward Caird taught William Beveridge, and that again fits in with this new liberal view of the creation of the welfare state. So it's not a straightforward picture, but in broad terms, I think that would be my answer there.
Okay. Wow. Okay. So I've been writing lots of notes, lots of things to pick up on with that. Let me start with one of the things you said earlier on, which is that in some ways, this idealism is a connection between ethics and politics. That politics should sort of reflect the ethical rather than power relations. And I know you sort of hedge that a little bit later, but then there's also the idea that for many of them, their idealist metaphysics kind of came out of ethical commitments. So that sounds very strange for most to most people, and I've had this as well when I start to talk about idealism. When I come at my reason for idealism, and I start to talk about things like the nature of truth, or trying to make space for other kinds of values like objective morality, I think, and I'd be interested to talk to you about this maybe separately, something objective about aesthetics as well. I see sort of latent there. Why, to many people, this seems illegitimate. They think the metaphysics should be based either on bare science, as many of the kind of people in the contemporary space who are idealists are talking about, or some other kind of rational principles or something of that sort. So, on what basis or what kind of legitimacy do you see, or and what motivated some of these early idealist thinkers to be drawn to an idealist metaphysics on the basis of ethics or some kind of conception of value?
Yeah. I think probably the best starting point is to look at what their conception of philosophy is. And you talk, as you rightly say, that the most contemporary philosophers, and certainly those who are influenced by the analytic tradition, are looking for some sort of set of truths that are self-justifying in a sense, or rationally justified. For the British Idealists, and this comes through very clearly in all of them, not least in Bradley, is that you have to start with the world around you. And that can be in terms of politics and ethics, but it's also in terms of one's metaphysical assumptions and conditions, and the conclusions that one arrives at. Bradley famously said at one point that philosophy was a way of arriving at bad reasons, really, for what you see around you. Now, Bradley has a certain sense of humour, which is there, but it starts with the idea of philosophy, and this is set out, which goes back to Plato. It goes back to, and it's there in Hegel, and it's very clearly set out in a piece that Green wrote, which was called The Philosophy of Aristotle, that came out in 1866. It's his first professional publication, leaving aside minor things in student magazines. And in that, he talks about that philosophy should start from the world around that it finds itself in. And what it does then is try to understand that world. It breaks it down into various, it looks at the assumptions, the ideas that underpin it, the propositions and judgments that make it up, and then analyzes those down into their constituent elements. Once it's done that, it can then start to look for any vaguenesses in the concepts. It can look for gaps in the way in which the world sees itself and presents itself, and also it can try and start to reconstruct And through the reconstruction in a more rational form, by trying to identify what are the, once we take away the contingencies of the world, what are we left with? And then we try and reconstruct a framework using the remaining elements. And that's, again, where we find these inconsistencies, gaps, vaguenesses, and so on. And that then is the enterprise of philosophy for the British Idealists. That's where it starts from. And importantly for them, they see this world as being not demarcated clearly. I mean, some of the later ones do, but so for the people we're talking about, they don't see the different departments of thought as being hermetically sealed off from one another. So aesthetics, ethics, metaphysics, logic, all are parts of a single world. And that's a crucial point for what they're saying, because ultimately, as we'll see, but this reaches its high point in somebody like in Bradley, or low point, depending on your view. It reaches its high point in Bradley, where actually you can only understand any one element within a system if you understand everything simultaneously at once. So you actually lose the idea of an element there. Everything just becomes this moment of perception. So that's where this distinction between metaphysics, logic, and ethics and politics starts to break down for the idealists. Because when they get to think about politics, about metaphysics and logic, if they're true to their method, they are talking about a particular set of questions, a particular set of considerations within, which is only understandable ultimately as part of a larger whole. So that's how politics and physics and philosophy comes together for the idealists.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So one more little bit on the metaphysics of what you said, and we'll go on to some of the politics stuff too. So I think that from what you said, and I'll flesh out this a little bit, and you tell me where I'm going wrong. Like on the one hand, we started off this by talking about how their metaphysics is influenced by their ethics or their idea of value. But then you said that their method was about kind of starting off with the world around you, thinking about the concepts you use to make sense of it. Now, for many people listening to that, they'll think, hang on a minute, that doesn't make any sense, because the world around me doesn't have value, right? The world around me is the tables and chairs and the people and the institutions or whatever that I interact with, whereas there is no value in the world around me. Value is something imposed. Now that, I would say, is obviously because they're operating with a very kind of materialist assumptions about what the world around them is. Whereas for the early British idealists, it's the sum total of the human experience of the world, which includes automatically value as interwoven with our very experience of the world, that we don't see merely, even a table isn't just a piece of wood with 4 bits of wood. It's something that has a use. It's something you eat your dinner on. It's useful. It has purposes. And it has a certain aesthetic appeal as well, so that the world around them that they're starting with is one that is already infused with value. And so value is in at the ground floor, kind of, so to speak. And so our metaphysics must account for that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I couldn't have put it better myself. No, I think that's true. And for them, this is always, that has to be borne in mind, that the world isn't, what exists and then what's imposed upon it in terms of the values. The values, as you say, are integral to the whole. And that they couldn't be understood precisely. I think your table example is a very good one, not one I'd thought of before, in the sense that to understand the table, you have to understand the purpose. And as soon as you start thinking about the purpose, you then think about what the goods, what sort of activities are undertaken, where does that fit into a world of activity? And that immediately then takes you into this idea around values. What is a value in the world? There's a difference here then that has to be drawn between what is in some sense of ultimate value, what should we value, and then what do we value. You see this at the start of Aristotle and Aristotle's Politics, of course, where he talks. He says that all associations are formed for some good. Now that good is for the good for the members. The good we might think is appalling. The Nazis came together for a good in their sense, but it's not a good that people are going to endorse now. But by the same token, a hospital is formed for a good. It has that, and for the idealists, they think that this applies generally across all domains of human activity, including politics and human life more generally.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Okay. I'll pick up again a little bit on that, and then I'll move on to this other question. I can see we're going to be talking for a long time here. One of the things that this seems to me then is this seems very different to the kind of project. So let's think about the context in which then the idealists are thinking this way, or they're deploying this method, because obviously they're talking about this right art in that tumultuous intellectual time of the 19th century with the rise of the new sciences. People like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham and so on are trying now to find how we can, given that the world as scientifically understood has been sort of stripped of value, as the Aristotelian sort of conception who had already been replaced anyway. They're trying to sort of bring some kind of ethical considerations back by looking at descriptive things such as pleasure and so on. So that seems like a very, very different kind of philosophical project compared to that the idealists are engaged in. And it seems very different to the kind of way ethics is done now in analytic philosophy as well. So could you just say something a little bit then about how this understanding of value being in at the ground floor in our experience of the world contrasts with other ways of trying to make sense of these things?
It's a very good question. I think one of the important things to notice is, first of all, they fit with an Aristotelian and virtue ethics approach. So if you look at the contemporary virtue ethics theorists, you may well, you can see certain things there. McIntyre, of course, was one like this. There is a school of thought which sees Charles Taylor as a Canadian idealist, and some people will try and trace that back to the British Idealists. I'm not sure how, sort of historically, biographically, whether that can be sustained. But so there are philosophical schools out there and working on ethics, and that are far more attuned to the sorts of approach that the idealists take. The idea of trying to derive values without considering the context in which one is thinking, for the idealist, is a complete anathema. This idea that there is, and the stereotyped view of Kantianism, where one thinks purely about, one thinks merely about pure reason, and tries to then use practical reason to derive forms of ethical judgments on that basis. For the idealists, they follow the line of Fichte and Hegel, which is that you have to look at the social embodiment of this principle, about where it sits and what are the underlying assumptions. And this becomes really significant. Well, it's really significant actually for Bradley right from the start. One of the great works, very difficult to read because it's not well written, but it is his presuppositions of critical history. And his presuppositions of critical history was published in pamphlet form in 1874. It's part of his work at Oxford. I think it's worth saying, we haven't mentioned it yet, that the British Idealists arise at Oxford and then also at Glasgow with Edward Caird, but Caird has previously been at Balliol with Green. In the presuppositions of critical history, Bradley asks, how should a historian go about reconstructing the past from the records? What is the nature of historical knowledge, really? And there he talks, importantly, as the title sets out, about what is being assumed when one is making historical judgment. So you have your historical record, but you have to interpret them. And part of what you're trying to do is uncover the presuppositions that are present within that material. But also part of what you're doing as a historian is you are making certain assumptions about the nature of that material. You have critical distance from it, for example. He gives the example of reports of stigmata in one's hand, that these were recorded in medieval texts as being things that arose in the hands of people who later generally became saints, to show their piety, that this was an echo of Christ's suffering on the cross and so on. And he says, well, we used to think that this is purely impossible, this is simply impossible, that these records must be false and so on. But now we know, he says, that one's mind can affect one's body in such a way that it makes it appear that one is having stigmata on one's hand. And he says, so the historian can go back and not dismiss that as a false record in the first instance, but as this could be the result of the mind acting on the body. So there, the important thing is that the presuppositions of the analysis are changing, and they are, first of all, we're trying to uncover the past, but we're also thinking about our present. And that, for the idealists, runs throughout their theory of ethics. And when you look at analytic philosophy now, if you take a Rawlsian view of analytic political philosophy, on one level, it's presented as a contextless enterprise, or at least it was by the initial. I think now people are becoming a bit more historical about Rawls, but initially it was taken in that way, that somehow the original position was a way of getting at what was truly important about justice. But now people are more likely to start emphasizing things around, while he's writing in the context of the rise of the American civil rights movement. He's trying to justify redistribution. He's also trying to justify a racially blind form of politics. He also wants wealth redistribution and so on. So it becomes far more contextualized. And I think for the British Idealists, that's the right move, because ultimately all philosophy is an expression of the culture in which it grows up. And of course, that's the sort of thing that annoys a lot of analytic philosophers now, because it's precisely the thing that they want to deny, that philosophy is a branch of cultural studies. But the idealists don't go quite that far, because they do think that they're that one can draw out certain things that are true, and in a sense true independent of the context. The validation of them and the justification is independent of the context in which they arise. But in order to understand those principles, you have to start with the thick-lived reality that one finds oneself in. So that's the difference there, I think.
Yeah, okay, and that's really what's drawn me to them, I think, is and I can see why that approach is. Maybe it's, who knows which comes first, whether the kind of metaphysical assumptions were there already and it influenced the way they understood ethics, or if it was the other way around. But if you are going to have a method that starts with context and our current assumptions and presuppositions, and also with the idea that there are values in at the ground floor in the world around us, that far more fits an idealist metaphysics, because an idealist metaphysics recognizes that the world is mind dependent. And so in our mind, we have values and assumptions and presumptions. And so those are already part of the world. They're already part of the world that we experience and interpret. There is no unmediated God's eye view that we might dream of if we're a good analytic philosophers or scientific in our thinking. I can see why the idealist metaphysics leads to that sort of way of understanding ethics, because like for Bradley, there are no real relations anyway. Everything is ultimately has to be harmonized and unified. And I know Bradley is not necessarily typical of all British idealists. but I can see how that fits. There's one little question I want to ask before, and if you think you're going to talk about this later when we get to Bradley in particular, we can do that. But that was that you suggested that they come at things with the world as presented to them. Now that might sound a little bit like sort of the common sense philosophy, or maybe not. But obviously where Bradley ends up, anyone who's watched this channel will realize he ends up somewhere that's very much removed from common sense or the world as it seems to be presented to us. So how does that sort of happen? How do you sort of start with the world as presented and end up with something like a unified absolute with there being no subject-object distinction ultimately and so on?
I think we will come on to this when we talk about Bradley, but I mean, what I would say is that where he gets back to, in many ways, is an unreflective. Well, it can look like an undifferentiated whole that, well, it is an undifferentiated whole for him, that where all of these propositions, if we were to be able to understand them properly, we'd have to understand them all at once. And he thinks that this is beyond any one of us, as finite individuals, which is where he starts to drift, I think, into mysticism. But this idea for him, and he, as you say, is very specific for him because the other British Idealists don't have the same metaphysics, is the view that we return in some ways with a clearer understanding of the world that we experience. But I think it'll be easier to talk about that once we get on to Bradley.
Yeah, fair enough. One other thing here, again, on the broad side on the metaphysics, was that you'd mentioned how, and this is what I'd picked up as well, that the British idealist approach sits in between the kind of detached, objective view from nowhere, the rules position outside of this. I can't remember exactly. What's it called again?
The original position of the veil of ignorance. Yeah.
Exactly. The original position of veiled ignorance is this sort of ultimately objective, outside of the contingencies of your own gender and race and identity and everything, and how would pure reason organize a just society. So that's a very kind of detached God's eye view of things. And then on the other side, you get the others that come at things from more maybe what we might think of now as the continental tradition, that see everything as constructed, whether by society or by the self and our own conceptions. And the British idealists seem to sit somewhere in the middle, recognizing that we have to treat our subjective viewpoint as always rooted in a certain context with certain assumptions, but that isn't the end point. There is, in the midst of that, when you recognize that, you're trying to get to something that is more objective than purely that position. Now, that to me seems to be linked with presumably the kind of underlying religious interests that seem to be driving a lot of them. I've got a quote here from your article, although I think you're mainly quoting Mandra at this point, where you're trying to talk about what is it that makes these relatively different thinkers that we're talking about legitimately ascribed to being part of the same movement. And you say here that something that unites them, these family resemblances, is they have the optimism, the faith in progress, both human and cosmic, the high ethical standards and religious aspirations that are characteristic of the common use of the term idealist, this sort of more sort of fluffier kind of idealism, less metaphysical. More than this, however, the British idealists shared the view that the realm of ideas is just the realm of the here and now transformed. They are not drawn beyond this world to some other, but rather make a division within this world between the higher and the lower. Now, I'll say a little bit more about that, and I'm really interested to hear your views. I think this is what was coming through when I started to read Bradley that really drew me to him, and then sort of to the idealist position more broadly. They have this, like you say, optimism, this hope, and that hope is towards ideals, these values of truth and goodness and so on. But those ideals they recognize as being somehow part of the world. So there is some objectivity to them. But that world is one that's integrated with the here and now. So very different to maybe more of the standard evangelical position in the 19th century that I know Bradley's father, I think, was a priest, right, or a vicar or something, where the ideal are in that on the other side, in some heavenly realm, some sort of better place out there that is detached ultimately from this world. Instead, they seem to be talking about this much more in terms of the deep nature of things are these values, that the fundamental reality is within this one, but it is perfected or purified, and that we are trying to somehow reach or dig down to that as part of this world, which to me was a far more appealing religious sentiment. And obviously, Bradley famously disappointed a lot of people in not believing in the afterlife, or not saying it might be true, but got no reason to believe it, right? And so it seems to me, interestingly, that this way of thinking sits, again, that those sort of more scientific and analytically minded don't like its subjective and contextual elements. Those that want to make everything about us and just how we understand things from the subjective viewpoint, disappointed as well, because they're still looking for some objectivity and value. It gets the religious people disappointed because they won't affirm some ultimate afterlife and hereafter. And yet, I think that it's sort of incredibly important and kind of what's a little bit missing from the philosophy that I'd been brought up with. I know that was a bit of a ramble. Anything you want to comment on with that?
No, I think that's right. And the fact that people disagree, I suppose, is just part of the nature of the project, really. And if you can't find people that disagree with you, then you're probably not saying anything worth saying.
And also, if you find everybody disagrees with you,
well, but this apart from your people, apart from the British Idealists themselves, and I think that there are, To my mind, the positions you set out of somebody who wants an analytic view, which is some notion of a view from nowhere, they're fooling themselves. Actually, what they're finding is they're importing a whole series of assumptions based on their own local contexts. And similarly, those people who want to have where it's only context, that's an interesting. An important thing to do to understand your position. I don't see it as philosophy. There's got to be something in the middle, which gets deeper into it. The best of the theme that you're talking about now. The best essay is by Bernard Bosanquet, and it's called "On the True Conception of Another World," and it started life as his introduction to the translation he made of the introduction to Hegel's philosophy of fine art. And that, if you buy the Penguin edition now, for example, they still use the Bosanquet translation. They've taken out the introduction. But actually, if you reread what Bosanquet says there, and people listening to this might find it interesting, it's in his volume on in Science and Philosophy, which you can find in various formats online. But there he says precisely as you've set out, Nathan, it's about the world re-spiritualized, and trying to bring the world in. There are a few things to say. I know we're already talking for a long time and you want to move on to other things, but in terms of religion, I think there are a few things to notice. First of all, not all of the idealists believed in God. So Bradley doesn't, Bosanquet I don't think does, but they do think that religious consciousness and that form of consciousness is vitally important. And that's where Bradley ends up with ethical studies, is the concluding remarks. He advocates a form of religious consciousness, but without God. And he pretty much puts it in those terms. He uses the phrase religious consciousness. But what makes it different is that it is in some sense a form of consciousness in which we forget ourselves and our own interests, in which we, as Aristotle talked about, contemplating the true and the good. This is the sort of thing that Bradley thinks that we should be moving towards. Now, as with Aristotle, he thinks that that's only possible for us for limited periods of time and we need to take rest. Most life isn't lived like that. But so you find that several years later, almost half a century later, 40 years at least, you find Bosanquet writes a short book which is called What Religion Is, and that very much argues for a similar sort of thing. But even amongst those idealists that were pious, that were religious and saw themselves as forms of Christians, they still were very conscious of the fact that they were nowhere near being orthodox. So Green, like Bradley, was raised. His father was a minister. Green's father was a rector in just outside Leeds, actually near my home, if that matters. But Green's own religion was far less orthodox than that of his father's, as far as we can work out what his father's position was. And for example, he denied the unique divinity of Christ. He thought that Christ was just a normal human being who lived in certain conditions and circumstances in Galilee at a particular point in time, which enabled him to realize the spiritual potentials that all human beings possess. And this went all the way through. There's a lovely story about Sir Henry Jones, who was a student of Edward Caird, another of the idealists who we're not going to talk about today, I don't think, too much. But he was called for an interview at a university, and they said to him, one of the interviewers said, "Mr. Jones, I understand that you deny the divinity of Christ." And Jones replied instantly, "No, sir, I deny the divinity of no man." So it's that idea that each of us has this potential, and it's that immanentist position that one finds in the idealists. So even those that were deeply pious, as Green was particularly, but also Caird and so on, and Henry Jones, their Christianity is very different to mainstream Christianity, certainly of their time. You do find people. There was a former Bishop of Durham who held a position which was very, very similar to this, but also they had an influence outside philosophical circles in the church, with people like William Temple, who became the Archbishop of Canterbury, and also Henry Scott Holland as well, who was a very prominent churchman in the early parts of the 20th century.
Yeah, so because Bradley attended church the entire time, and I really liked his defense. I think I picked up somewhere when he was asked about his views, and he said something like, "Oh, I don't know enough theology to know whether I'm a heretic or not." And I think that was, I mean, he's approaching things philosophically, and certainly with the absolute idealists, whether they would be theist or not, believe in God or not, just seems to come down to the question of whether they identify the absolute with God. And for Green, it's yes, right? For Bradley, it's no. Because if you believe in the absolute as this sort of foundation of values that is immanent in the world, then really whether you identify that with God or not is going to depend probably on what your conception of God is. And for Bradley, God is this practical sort of ethical being, and the absolute is more than that. And the absolute obviously includes suffering and evil as well, even though it's transformed and this sort of thing. So I think maybe nowadays there certainly seems to be elements in Christian thinking and understanding about the relation between heaven and earth that might make them seem less heretical, certainly from the stuff I've been looking at. But yes, I think in that 19th century kind of Charles Spurgeon, fire and brimstone, pulpit thumping evangelicalism, it would have been very, very different. But that sentiment, I think, is important to their philosophy, and for me anyway, highly appealing, and is the sort of thing I think that Collingwood saw being leached out of philosophy to its detriment. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. You know, it does come down to what one thinks you have to believe in order to have a religious position, and there is much more to be said about that.
Yeah, fair enough. Okay, so then lastly, I noticed on your website for this stuff, I noticed on the website that you are not, and just want to make sure people realize this, you're not just looking at this from a historical point of view for historical interest, but it said something about seeing how this might apply to the contemporary context. So rather than necessarily, I don't want to put you on the spot on various political views you have, unless you're happy to share. If you're happy to, it's fine for you to share them. But in what sense do you think, sort of looking at the idealism and new liberalism that was emerging around this time, what is it about that might have something important to say to the contemporary context we find ourselves in? Do you think?
I think one thing is about has now become unfortunately much needed again, which is about welfare provision, socialised welfare as well, particularly, and about the importance of well, the most fundamental question is why do we think that there are such things as property rights? Why do we respect the right to private property? And for some people, this is just taken as a given that this has to exist, and that as Nozick says at the start of Anarchy, State and Utopia, individuals have rights, and there are certain things you can't do to them without violating those rights. That these are things that we're born with, like we're born with arms and legs. And that isn't the position that one finds in the British Idealists. With the British Idealists, rights are social constructions. Now, you might have a morally valid claim that you would argue for, and you would argue then that should be recognised as a right, but right themselves is not. Requires social recognition. You can't have a right without that. And also, that's for moral rights. For legal rights, of course, you have to have legal recognition and legal embodiment in statutes and decisions and practice, legal practice. In relation, that's important in the present context because so often rights to private property are treated as if they are simply one. I mean, this is the circular nature of the argument that justifies this, that they are treated as one's property independently of any other considerations. For the idealists, rights are only valuable to the extent that they bolster a community in which everybody is able to realise their potentials. And that's a really crucial argument that needs to be reinforced. I think, that there's a standpoint where you can judge people's rights. And particularly actually when you move to the rights of corporations and non-natural persons as well. Why would we think that BP has a right to its property, rather than being taxed heavily, than the shareholders and so on? Do they have it? In what sense do we justify giving them a right? So that's one area, and the other area is in relation to civil disobedience, which I'm also working on, where I think the idealists have a huge amount to say about the moral duty to be civilly disobedient.
Okay. Yes. I can see all that, and actually, I can see how that relates to their metaphysics of the self, and the notion of self-realization and everything, because then they're not highly individualistic, and this seems to be part of their metaphysical view. If reality is ultimately one, if it's ultimately a harmonious sort of system, or something of that sort, then you cannot think that you are isolatable as an individual. You are who you are in terms of your place within the system. But then the civil disobedience you mentioned is Bradley's recognition at the end of ethical studies that sometimes you're I may well be misremembering this, and I'm keen to be corrected on it. It seems like he talks about your station and its duties, but then realizes that sometimes the way to be faithful to your society is by trying to reconfigure society itself in this final move. Is that right?
Yeah, at the end, I mean, everybody focuses in ethical studies. Everyone focuses on the fifth essay, which is my station and its duties, as if that's the final that's the final point for. And there's an American edition where that is where it ends. I mean, it's appalling. But actually, as you say, Nathan, there's a line, literally a line drawn in the text at this point. After Bradley has set out his position, which is a very collectivist position of the core part of my station and its duties. And then he goes on to say, but you cannot confine a man to his station and its duties. And he gives a whole series of reasons about why that is, which are then lead into the next essay, which is Ideal Morality, which is a far more about the embedded nature of one's citizenship and also the need for a critical view of established relationships. So, that transition, and then it moves on in subsequent chapters, 2 other chapters. But, that's the importance, as you say, of not taking my station and its duties as the statement of Bradley's own position on ethics, because it isn't.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think already I can see a lot of ways in which their metaphysics and their ethics and their political theories all very much intertwined, which is great. I think most people who come to philosophy start off being drawn by the big questions and by those sorts of large topics and ways in which everything interact. And then certainly as you become more professional in it, your interests tend to narrow and narrow and narrow, and you end up talking about something that nobody reads. I've got a book coming out later this year that'll be like that, on Frager's mature last years of his life views on truth as set out in logical investigations. Right. So something that's going to be very interesting to some people. But what I love about YouTube, and where I think there's really real space for people like yourself, is to again try to ask those bigger questions of life in a rigorous way. The kind of thing that you say was their methodology, right? Trying to understand reality in the whole, see how everything's connected. And in some ways, that's a lot easier to do on platforms like YouTube than it is in academia, or so I've found. Yeah. And so, yes. All right, we better move on because
yeah. I just wanted to mention before we do that he's talking about individualism and they're very collectivist. I think we'll have to break that down because and differentiate between the social ontology and the moral and the normative, because that is, and we will talk about this, I think, but that will start to. That becomes a real problem, I think, for some of the idealists when we talk about the difference between personal and objective idealism in the British Idealists.
Okay, yeah. So, to be honest, we could ask that question next. I mean, it's only skipping over one, really. So there is this division that isn't necessarily just splits the thinkers, but as you'd mentioned, was it Ritchie that switches?
It's Andrew Seth Pringle Patterson.
Oh, that's right. Yes. Okay. So, but there are these two different kinds of idealism. You have the absolute idealism, and you have personal idealism. Can you say a little bit about those metaphysical views and sort of where they differ?
Yeah, sure. So, if one thing that idealists agree in different ways is that reality should be, when it's properly understood, is understood in the whole, as a whole. And there's a number of different, so this is where we came back. We've been talking previously about differences of judgments. Bradley has a particular view where there are no relation, where reality has to be understood at once time, with in a moment of contemplation as one thing. There's less, the other idealists don't hold that position. But the important question that relates to the distinction between personal and objective idealists is what mind is capable of doing that? Is it the mind of a human being like you and I, which they characteristically, certainly from sort of Bradley and Bosanquet onwards, refer to as the finite self. So you and I here and now. For the personal idealists, they think that if we are going to talk about reality and it being understood by some mind, it can only be the minds of individual finite human beings. And so the people who hold to that view, John McTaggart, Ellis McTaggart, is one, the Cambridge British idealist. And then Andrew Seth Pringle Patterson, in the middle period of his life, holds this position and writes very effective critiques of Bosanquet on that ground. Arguably, I think Green holds that position as well. I think he's a personal idealist rather than an objective idealist, but that's a very controversial position to hold. But the objective idealist, so if the personal idealists think that only finite minds can be the type of mind that can understand and hold the whole of all judgments together. For the objective idealists, they think that no finite mind can do this. It can only be done by groups of minds or communities. And so the absolute then, and well, that's where it is with Bosanquet, I think. But when it gets to Bradley, it seems to start drifting into mysticism, where you have almost a mind without a brain, and this is, and I wonder in that point whether what happens to you and I think that there is something. The way he writes implies that there's a mind without a brain, but I think probably is closer to Bosanquet in reality. But there's that difficulty of what is the absolute. See, this is my own struggle with this. Is I'm very much in the personalist position, and I can't see how one can make sense of this idea. But certainly for Bosanquet, what we can say is he thinks that a community in its life embodies certain values and ways of viewing the world, and that can be better or worse depending on how close it becomes to encapsulating and covering all parts and realizing all parts of that whole that's required. And that's the distinction there between personal and objective idealism. And it's a distinction within the British idealists as well. So, as I say, on the personalist side, you get Andrew Seth Pringle Patterson, John McTaggart. You also, as I say, I think find Green. But then you're on the other side for the objective idealists. It is people like Edward Caird, it's Bernard Bosanquet, it's F.H. Bradley, William Wallace. There's that. There are far more of them on that end of things.
Does it also split anything between sort of the monist and pluralist view? Because if you're a personal idealist, there is no mind that's holding everything together. And if an individual finite center, finite self is capable of contemplating everything, then does that give you a fundamental pluralism in your ontology?
I think it depends on the level that you're talking about, to be honest. I think that for the British idealists, I think they're all, the end point, if we were to get to it, would be the same for everybody. But in our daily lives, we will see different perspectives. And this has a direct impact on their ethics and their politics as well. That what one's trying to do is bring together divergent viewpoints in order to construct a more coherent whole. But it is one whole that they see at the end of it. So depending on what one means by monistic or pluralistic, then I think that's the answer.
Okay, all right, great. So that gives us a bit of an idea about that. So you may think we've talked about this already, in which case we can move on. But I had here sort of how the method of the idealists differ from analytic philosophy. Do you think you've sufficiently covered that, or do you want to say something about that?
One thing worth emphasising that I think was only implicit in what we said before was that for the idealists, reality is a mental construction. Whereas when you move into the 20th and 21st century, of course, this becomes a far more accepted position. Somebody like John Searle, for example, the social construction of reality, talks about these sorts of things. It's a far more accepted position. But they do have the importance then of emphasizing that all philosophy is any philosophical position that you arrive at has to be reconsidered in light of changed circumstances and changed assumptions. So this idea that philosophy is an iterative process. This is certainly Bradley's position. He's very explicit about that, I think, in the preface to the Principles of Logic, that all we're trying to do at the moment is trying to understand the world as we see it. And this, of course, is anathema to those, to analytic philosophers who if they're looking for eternal veritas, then there is a tension then within the British Idealists, which is, are we looking for eternal truth, or are we looking for a more of a cultural study? I think one of the presuppositions that runs throughout their thought is that there are certain things in the mind that are hardwired, and that these will show themselves in any form of society. And this is where they have the baseline for conceptions of space and time. A lot of they ended up doing it. Bradley ultimately thinks that space and time are unreal. Certainly, and you find a different theory, but very much coming to a similar conclusion in McTaggart and so on about time. But that isn't. When you look at somebody like Green, Bosanquet, and so on, that they will see these forms of thought as being eternal in the way that one finds in Kant, and that no matter how you identify and how you analyze any context, you'll still find these things coming up. And there's also certain views around human nature as well. So, and this is human nature that requires contextualizing and expression through certain social forms. So this is where the Hegelian side of them comes through, that they take on different manifestations, but they're all basically, human beings are social, human beings in the sense that they gain the sense of their own identity, as well as that they need to live together for material reasons. The more important thing for them is that actually, of course, that they gain a sense of their own identity as well through this process of intersubjective recognition. And intersubjective recognition plays a big part in their ethics and in their politics. And arguably, as I say, when you move into particularly the absolute idealists, I think that this maybe that's the mechanism whereby the absolute gets realized for somebody like Bosanquet.
Yeah. So the intersubjective is not the objective, because it's effectively the commonality of subjects rather than something outside of subjects, right?
Yeah, so intersubjective recognition is that we come to understand ourselves by the way in which we react to how we're treated by others in the world. So, our parents have raised us with certain expectations. We come to understand ourselves in certain ways. They might think, that I have particular skills and you have other skills, and we start to live up to those images of ourselves. And part of the problem can be where those expectations don't match how we feel about ourselves. And that can provoke a response against it. But even that is a response against a particular set of expectations and interpretations of us that other people we think have misinterpreted us. So that's in very, very crude forms. That's the nature of intersubjective recognition. And it's different to a view which says that our interactions with other people have no deep effect on who we are as moral agents, and that this is a sort of form of atomism that one finds in various forms of liberal theories, particularly.
Yeah, so I thought that, and that was something I was going to. I don't think we had it on my list, but there did seem to be that bit of tension in that. The bits that I've read about their notion of self-realization is so much of that is done in the push and pull of our interactions with one another. So it seemed to me then you had much more of a basis in that thinking for valuing things like family as sort of these environments in which we grow and develop and become self-realized, which sort of pushes back against this sort of atomized individualism that we see in contemporary contexts. And I'm a huge fan of family. I just had a daughter 10 days ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. So she's my third. And I think that it comes with its difficulties, but it is also where so much self-formation occurs, I think. So that's something that I think is important in the contemporary context. But as you've mentioned, that's not typically associated with liberalism. Liberalism tends to be associated more with this freedom from constraint and those around you. And yet here, your center is, obviously it's new liberalism.
Yeah.
There's liberalism there. How does that work?
Yeah. So again, if people are interested, the best starting point probably is Green's lecture on liberal legislation and freedom of contract, which is in the third volume of his works, and again is widely available on the internet. And he starts off by saying, he writes this, he delivers it to working people in 1881. It's reflecting upon a whole series of legislation that's been passed over the past 10 years by conservative and liberal governments under the ground, that pushes for state intervention in various areas. He focuses on such areas as temperance and restriction of alcohol, but also about the Factory Acts in relation to the types of terms and conditions that can be offered and accepted at work. So, the governments have been restricting those. So even if you found an employer and a prospective employee who are willing to agree on that they would work in a factory that had no guards on the machines, that the government would rule that contract to be invalid, because it's important to have those things. But also about private property around the Ground Game Act, which is about hunting and so on, about the importance of restricting property rights in relation to land as well, which is another very important area. And the question he asks is, how can liberals support state intervention to stop individuals on the face of it doing what they want? And his answer is, that's a naive view about what individuals want, because it ignores questions around power, particularly, and the fact that if the choice is between accepting this abusive contract, contract at work, let's stick with those, or starving, being unemployed and being starved, then if that's the choice, is that really the sort of freedom that liberals should want to protect? And he says, well, no, because most people, when you talk about freedom, what they're talking about is the freedom to live a life that has some meaning and in which you are able to realize your potentials. And a lot of these sorts of issues, a lot of the rights that are granted, particularly in relation to work, but also in relation to the sale of alcohol, are ones that will stop you at exercising a free choice. So he thinks that because it's only the laissez-faire attitude about certain forms of liberalism only works if you ignore what actually freedom is. And for him, freedom is far more about self-mastery, taking the individual deciding what they truly want in their lives and how they truly want to live, and realizing their potentials. And he thinks that this then becomes the basis of what should be a liberal view. And that's what marks that move from the laissez-faire liberalism of the 19th century into the new liberalism of the early 20th century, and ultimately, arguably, into various forms of welfarism, not least in the UK, but sort of internationally as well.
Yeah, so obviously that seems to me to be touching on the distinction between what we might call negative freedom and positive freedom. Negative freedom is just freedom from restraint and coercion, which would allow you to take on jobs with no safety precautions and so on. Positive freedom is looking at what things need to be supplied to the individual to enable them to be free. And this seems to tie in a lot with, yes, their conceptions of the self and the good as this self-realization, becoming who you can be. Now, one thing I was going to ask you about this, I don't have an opinion on it or no, but there seems to me a certain kind of conception of self-realization that is the sort of thing that people might have put on a t-shirt 20, 30 years ago, like just be yourself or something, or be your authentic. And there seems to be that kind of push about, I am a certain type of person, I have an authentic, essential nature, and I have to make sure that that isn't squashed. But that tends to be an individualistic notion of freedom to be yourself. In other words, I have who I am in a self-contained essence, and I just need to make sure that my mum and those bad people out there, my mum and dad and society and all those sort of tutters and so on, don't stop me expressing myself. But it seems to me that the little I've read is that's not the kind of positive freedom that Green was probably talking about, or others talking about. Instead, it's providing you the opportunity to kind of become and learn and grow into who you could be, rather than some kind of expression of something you already are that's been squashed. Is that fair?
Yeah. So it's about the growth element. It talks about self-realization, and it's a process. And that fits precisely with what you're saying. He doesn't use so he distinguishes four different senses of freedom. The first is formal freedom, freedom of the will. And the freedom of the will, he says, is will is free when the agent understands themselves as an agent, that they refer all of their desires and the choices that they have to themselves as an agent. And he says that is the essence, that is a defining thing of what it is to be distinctively human, this phrase, distinctively human. So the will then is free. And there are lots of actions that are performed by us in some sense, but aren't formally free. So the drug addict, for example, is driven by their desires, they have no or little control over what they're doing. Any form of alcohol, gambling, drugs, and so on. So that's formal freedom. Then there is what he calls juristic freedom, which is far closer to negative freedom, which is freedom from being interfered with by other people, being compelled by the state or anyone else to act in a particular way. Then he talks about true freedom, which is the freedom that you've just been outlining. Somebody is truly free if they are acting in such a way that helps them to develop and realize their potentials. And that there's no set path for each of us that we can go down. So it's not that authentic hippie sort of, be yourself. And it's very sort of static, in some ways, sort of strangely conservative, individualistic view of things. But then he also talks about positive freedom. But positive freedom for him has a very specific meaning. And it means the freedom that one has as a citizen to contribute to the common good. Mm-hmm. So that's where, if people read about Green and freedom, it's vital to bear in mind that when Berlin popularized this notion of positive and negative freedom, it doesn't match easily onto Green's distinctions, not least because for true freedom, where you are realizing your own potentials and so on, for Berlin, if you equate that with positive freedom, Berlin thought, well, somebody else might know better than you do what your true interests are. So the state might be able to tell you, right, well, for your own good and for your own freedom, we are going to stop you from hearing this, propaganda from the West. It's generally seen as a Cold War doctrine. This distinction that Berlin popularizes between negative and positive freedom, with positive freedom being an excuse used by states and organizations to impose their will upon you and tell you that they're making you free. So, but for Green, you can't be positively free unless you subjectively choose to do something which will actually realize your potentials. You can't, I can't force you to be free. I can't force you to be positively free. It's something I can create the conditions under which you might come to see yourself in a particular way and understand, have a more reflective view of yourself. But that doesn't. But you have to make the next step. I can't make it for you. So that's a crucial distinction in the freedom, and that goes all the way through their ethics, all the way through the politics, and that's a unifying theme for all of them.
But also, you mentioned there that it's about freedom to contribute to the common good, and that involves a kind of relational engagement with the context in which you find yourself. Okay, which to me is far more appealing, far more the kind of freedom and good that I find interesting, as opposed to the kind of existentialists' idea of like just pure sort of individual bad faith, good faith in terms of this acting out your authentic inner self.
But even with so I mean, I'll come on to contributing to the common good in a second. But I think even with true freedom, when we talk, that can still be achieved through your communal identities and your communal activities. You do it through working with others, and part of that as well. I mean, this is where true freedom and positive freedom do start to merge. So looking at the role of a parent there is, of course, looking after the interests of their children. And it's in so many reasons why one would do that. But one reason is because that enriches your own life. For yourself, you become a different type of person because of it. But there's also the sense that in working for the common good, which he sees in far more of a civic terms, that by being an assertive, thoughtful citizen and doing what you think is in the interest of the community as a whole, means first of all you get something out of that. You get a lot out of that as an individual, because it helps to, you are a social being that wants to help contribute to the world, and again maybe goes back to this notion of idealism that we started with. But there's also the sense that if our identities are formed through intersubjective recognition, the quality of the identities that result will reflect in part the quality of the types of civic relationships that we have. If we live in a society where some groups are excluded and marginalized and treated as less than human, then everybody suffers because of that. Because although on one level the advantaged group might get more benefits, in another level they lose the crucial sense of themselves as being human beings, and that that undermines that sort of Kantian element that we talked about earlier in the realization of our humanity. So on one level, there's a pragmatic justification for positive freedom, as in Green's sense of freedom to contribute to the common good. There's a pragmatic justification for that, but there is also this other side of things which does start to bleed back into true freedom. They're not sharp distinction there, but there is something to be said for it as a distinction. And certainly when he presents it, he tends to use positive freedom for the common good and true freedom for self-realization.
All right. So I've got one thing here, though, which I had mentioned to you that I think is an interesting way to talk about how something that you'd written about Green's view could be quite interestingly applied to our current context, which is that you said that he had this idea that as that sort of the franchise of the public space opened up, I might have misunderstood what you're saying, but the idea that more and more people were able to voice their views and opinions, that this actually created this sort of cacophony of voices that created clouded understanding, right? So could you say a little bit more about what his concern was here and how that might relate to what people talk about some of the dangers of social media these days?
No, so that is in reference to what he writes in Popular Philosophy and Its Relation to Life, which is his second publication, which came out in 1868. So it's an early piece, but he is very politically active at this point. So it's an interesting context in which to read the piece. But what he says there is that the problem with modernity, and he uses this word, the problem with modernity is that it's too, in some ways, it's a quite Platonic analysis. Every opinion has a place, or every opinion is given a place, and there is very little reflection on the truth or otherwise of those opinions and the validity of those opinions, and that this leads to a chaos which can only be resolved through power, where the most powerful or loudest voice is the one that wins. But so that's what he's saying in 1868. I think certainly by the time you get to the end of it, I died unexpectedly at the 1882, but there he's far more concerned to justify and recognize the value of pluralism within society, about plural voices. And in fact, he says that this is one of the reasons why he defends the extension of the franchise so vigorously. And he's already doing this in 1868. So maybe this isn't a shift of philosophical position, but it's because he thinks each of us brings our own perspective on society, and that we should include those perspectives in a public debate. So if we look at it in contemporary terms, in terms of contemporary political philosophy, he is a participatory democrat. And the participatory democrat, what marks them out, usually they're contrasted with deliberative democrats. Participatory democrats are very much concerned with the blood and guts and the life of actual politics. It includes things like protest meetings. It includes things like taking to the streets and so on, and living one's values in one's daily life. Deliberative democracy tends to be far more constrained, almost seminar-based. It's this sort of idea that one sits down and through a rational discussion, one can arrive at an agreement, or at least a consensus. And that consensus building, in many ways, is particularly pronounced in deliberative democracy, but it's also there, I think, in much of participatory democracy as well. And that is important, not because he thinks that diverse voices can bring something to the discussion, but what makes the difference between what he says in 1868 in Popular Philosophy in its relation to life and what he says in his later writings is that he comes to emphasize far more the notion of civic virtue as a way of overcoming the disparate voices, not because he wants that everybody should agree more, but that they should be willing to engage in discussion with each other, and that can, but through their daily lives, and this can be expressed in any number of ways, not just through a rational discussion that one might find in deliberative democracy, but also through art, through protest, and so on. But there has to be, the civic virtue element is that it has to be, first of all, undertaken with a way to, in a recognition that other people have differences of view and that you're trying to find some sort of consensus, but also that requires you to be tolerant in some way, and he thinks this is what's missing really from the cacophony that he sees in modernity in that early piece that he writes.
Right. Okay. So maybe then he'd be for sort of social media and things in principle, but not so excited about the echo chambers that result where
exactly. That's what I wrote in my notes. Yes.
Oh, is it? Okay, there you go. Preempted that. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I
that
mean,
is
yeah, something else I'm doing at the moment is just coming out, which is precisely about echo chambers and moral panics, and the trans debate actually is coming out in a journal called Deviant Behaviour, which is a great title, isn't it? But this is actually really looking at the cacophony that he's talking about in that early piece, but I don't
yeah,
frame it in terms of green.
right. Okay. Yeah, I can see that. And also the difficulty is that as things become more short form and there's less
Mm-hmm.
critical engagement with things, things become more sensationalist, become more
Yeah,
clickbaity or whatever. That is also working against the idea of the multitude of voices, right?
yeah,
Which is you can see how it relates to some of the things you mentioned before about how the way to reach that sort of broader, thicker, more harmonized understanding is through adopting various perspectives and recognizing the ways in which they integrate together, harmonize together.
yeah.
That process has to involve engaging with alternative viewpoints.
Yeah, and if you find there's a later British idealist who actually only died in December 1990 was Michael Oakeshott, and
Yeah,
Oakeshott in his famous collection Rationalism in Politics has a piece there about conversation and the conversation of humanity, and that's precisely what he's getting at there is this idea, and it's not so much a debate as a conversation. That crucial distinction there,
yeah,
because a debate implies that one side is trying to beat the other, whereas a conversation implies that somebody's they're trying to understand each other and arrive at a consensus, and that has to be, for all of the fact that the politics is about confrontation, and that Green was certainly very heavily involved in that, as were many other idealists, Bosanquet, not Bradley, but many of the others were engaged in that sort of thing. But it's not being done for its own sake as a way of browbeating other people into silence or forcing them to accept one's view. It's about trying to start a conversation.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so you're moving away from the combative into the far more kind of collegiate
Yeah.
environment for it. Yeah, yeah, which I think is important for sure. And actually, to be honest, I think it's more informative for the viewers as well. If I watch a
Mm,
debate, the entire kind of toolkit that the speakers use is often underhanded, rhetorical, and certainly not very charitable. And so you actually get less. You actually learn less about the views. It becomes harder to make a decision than when you hear two people discuss, even if they're coming at things from different positions. So yeah, that sounds good. Um, all right. Well, we'll see how much. If we only get through green today, then that's just what we do, and
Sorry, I
we'll have to
didn't
come
mean
back
it.
together. Now, this always happens. This always happens. Uh, yeah. So, okay, I've got here that you'd mentioned that Green's ethics. So, I'll just a little bit of background for people listening. So, his metaphysics that he puts forward is in the Prolegomena to Ethics. Is that right? Is that the exact title?
Yeah, well, that's how it's often read. Yeah.
Right, but I've got the right title, right? Prolegomena to
Yes, it's
Ethics.
prolegomena to ethics. So, but
Yeah, and in that he starts off with his metaphysics in the opening. Was it third or something? And then
yeah,
he moves on to. So what is that? How does that connection work? What
okay.
role does the metaphysics play in that?
I mean, I think the first thing to say is that although because it's a posthumously published book, he didn't oversee its publication. Okay, he died unexpectedly of blood poisoning. It looks like it was blood poisoning, but it was in the final stages. The manuscript lacks 20 pages that he thought he was going to add, but the editor A.C. Bradley himself, a sort of Shakespeare scholar, he was a great friend of Green's. He edited the volume and he put the title on it of Metaphysics of Knowledge. But actually, the book, that first 100 pages had been published on a series of articles that came out in the journal Mind over the previous couple of years under the title of Can There Be a Natural Sciences of Man? And that's all and that gets translated into This is Green's Metaphysics, but it isn't, because Green, what that first 100 pages or so of the Prolegomena is trying to do is to answer the question, to head off the objection, which is very prevalent in his time, that natural sciences, particularly evolutionary theory, but also biology and science, can explain something, biology and psychology, can explain something about human consciousness that is significant for morals. Okay? And that we can reduce then human experience to a scientific base. And that's what he's trying to head off. So people then go and look at, because of this is styled in the book as a metaphysics, they go and look for that, what one would expect of a full metaphysical theory, and then they don't find it. And then they say Green is a bad metaphysician. Now, there's the first two volumes of his works also include a lot of metaphysics and a lot of long writings on logic and so on that he gave to his students. So there is material there, but it's not systematized into Green's own metaphysics. Similarly, when one gets to the Prolegomena, he was writing just for that purpose. So this then does get into your question of why is it there? You know, what does he see as the relationship between that first 100 pages, which is which contains elements of metaphysics, and his writings on ethics. So the first thing is, he thinks that by the end of that 100 pages, he has established human beings as self-realizing, that human beings are beings who are responsible for their actions, they possess formal freedom, and that they are therefore ethical beings who can pursue their own self-realization. That's what he thinks he gets to at the end of that 100 pages.
Right. Okay. So, and then that, whether it's metaphysics or not, is obviously a very important kind of foundation from which to build his ethics. But there's stuff in there. There are things in there that sound like metaphysical claims, right? To do with the spiritual principle, to do with.
There are. But as I say, it's only elements of a metaphysics. It's not a whole metaphysical theory, because people say, "Oh, he should be tackling other questions as well as the ones that he does." But the question, so for example, one of the most famous parts of those first 100 pages is where he talks about the eternal consciousness, or the. He refers to it in various ways. He refers to it most famously as the eternal consciousness, the spiritual principle, but also he talks about it as the human spirit, and he talks about it as human nature. And that often gets pushed to the side by people who want to condemn him and say that this is just a theory of religion, masquerading as a theory of God, as a theory of metaphysics. And certainly he did. I think this is a core element of his understanding of what God was, but importantly, he talks about the eternal consciousness as being a vehicle. We are vehicles for the eternal consciousness. Individual human beings are vehicles. In his religious writings, though, he talks about that it's important to be careful about what we think about that relationship between God and man. And he says we are the same, the spiritual principle in humanity, the eternal consciousness, is the principle of our being, in the same way that an acorn and the oak, the traditional hackneyed example that people attribute to Aristotle, that the principle of the acorn is found in the oak. And he thinks the same thing happened, and he uses that example. He says the principle of a human being is God. Now that's not saying that they're the same thing. What he's saying is that the potential and the things that give the telos of the human being is to realize the qualities one finds in God, and that helps to make that link then between his religion and his metaphysics.
So the spiritual principle, which well, it'd be interesting to hear you explain a little bit what he thinks that is. But the reason why he might also call it human nature is presumably that he's meaning not human nature as actually manifest right now, but sort of human telos, human potential, human sort of idealized nature. Of the sort, actually, going back, that you said that he understood Jesus Christ as effectively then having attained to as a human in this sort of because every human has the potential for divinity, or of realizing then that, and Jesus is one person anyway that did so. I think there are sort of ideas of that.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. That's exactly those first 100 pages give the philosophical expression of that view, and it's a coordinating principle in many ways of our experiences of the world, and an attempt. And he thinks that this is what makes human agency possible, is the fact that we partake of, as he puts it, this principle. In other words, that it's within us, that we try and organize our experiences. We think about our moral relationships, and he thinks that is what drives us forward. And we come to know it because we look at the world around us and think, how could this world exist? And he thinks, well, you have to have something which is driving us forwards to realize those things about ourselves, those higher potentials, and that we recognize this in other people as well, and that this is part of that community, the building up of communities is through that process. And again, he brings back lots of the themes that we've been talking about intersubjective recognition. So intersubjective recognition is partly about you and I talking about our own individuality, and we see those things reflected in the way in which we treat your children, the way in which we treat each other is part of that development of a sense of our own identity. But there's also and our particularity, but there's also a sense that we come to recognize as the commonalities that we have, the fact that we are humans, and that brings us back to this more Kantian position, more Kantian elements in his ideas of human nature, and in terms of a metaphysics, it's again worth noting that those first 100 pages are adapted from lectures that he was giving in Oxford on Kant. So they basically grow out of a Hegelian critique of Kant, and there's quite a lot. Kant gets a good look in those first 100 pages. He's an interlocutor in that, but it's very much a Hegelian Fichtean rereading of Kant that one finds that one finds in those first 100 pages, and that's what Green thinks he requires in order to establish that human beings are self-realizing, and that they're not simply the result of some form of materialist mechanism that you might find in an evolutionary theory. Yeah,
and of course, as you'd mentioned before, that was a highly important task in his context, because I actually did a video on this recently, just looking at that key period in that, as we had gone from so there's a double whammy there, it seems to me, in that evolutionary theory textual criticism had undermined sort of belief in revelation through scripture, which put into doubt the entire way of understanding meaning and morality as divinely given. And then there was evolution that undermined the idea of humans being fallen creatures into being risen creatures, effectively, but with no actualized perfection, right? Because there was no perfect state that we could look to as inspiration. And then similarly, it seems to sort of undermine the idea of there being any kind of morality. And then I'm not sure exactly when Green wrote the Prolegomena of Ethics. You say it's 1880 something.
Yeah, he's writing in 1878 to 70, to about 1880. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm not sure exactly where psychology was at that point. But again, psychology to me seems to be threatening the same thing to the human mind and reason that was going on through evolutionary theory. The idea of it being mainly impulsive, driven by the unconscious and desires rather than rational.
Yeah, so there is a debate that's going on in Germany particularly, but it's also in the pages of Mind as well, in the journal Mind. And it's very interesting to read. I wrote one of the books I wrote about Green sort of goes into this. For Green, the big debate was, at the time in Mind at least, and this seems to be the debate that Green is concerned with, are you responsible for impulses that you feel and acting on the impulses that you feel? And for him, you're only responsible for those things that are referred to you as in which you are self-conscious. If you are able to, if you understand yourself as the agent who is acting in a particular way, and he thinks that the unconscious, if your unconscious is driving you, you're not self-referential. I think there's a problem with that claim, but I think that seems to be the claim that he's making, because he doesn't think that we're driven. He thinks in order to act, we have to take material from our animal impulses. And these are the animal impulses that we would all think of: anger, hunger, fear, sex, all of those sorts of things. But we only become responsible for those things if we understand ourselves as being, that we are angry, it's something about us, it's a choice. He gets himself, I think, in a contradiction here, because there's two elements, and this comes to the nature of the will, because on one side he seems to adopt a fairly standard view that you can self-intervene, that you can say, right, I'm faced with a choice. I want to steal the loaf of bread, or I can stop myself from doing it. And I step in, I make a choice. I decide I'm going to steal the loaf of bread. Okay? I am responsible for that choice. But there's another side to what he says, is that actually our will is simply our personality reacting automatically to the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And there is no moment of self-intervention. All there is just, but now people will, and you'll still then be able to say that we're responsible, but we're responsible in quite a different way. And this is a line actually you find in lots of the other idealists, you find it in Bosanquet as well. And the reason we're responsible is because we are determined to act in a certain way by our personality. It's not that we're determined by something outside of ourselves. It's only us in this circumstance that leads to this form of action. And so therefore we are responsible for that action.
Sounds quite compatibilist, really.
Yeah.
Okay. So I've done other videos on free will that that are quite popular. I think that we need to recapture belief in free will. I mean, a lot of people still do believe in it, but there is a big movement saying that we don't have it. I think we need some conception of free will to be able to ask about moral responsibility, I think. So I'm interested to look a bit more about that. But
sorry, but just to say that I think he still thinks that you can, even without this idea of if by free will is meant self-intervention, then he still thinks you don't need to have that to have moral responsibility. That's
But so the compatibilist free will would say take the sort of line, it sounds like you're saying he advances, which is that what matters is whether the source of the action is in something that you identify with, say like your personality or something
Yeah.
of that sort. And I know sort of Bradley has a funny thing on free will and what we identify with ourselves, but I think we'll probably have to leave Bradley for today.
Yes. Yeah.
But one other thing I wanted to ask on that is, you'd said how this first 100 pages of the Prolegomena to Ethics was his sort of move against the purely mechanistic view of the world, to sort of, again, create space for ethics, create space for the sort of teleology of human nature, that we are aiming towards some kind of realization, some kind of spiritual principle and things like that. So how does he sort of justify that position? Why is that sufficient to label him an idealist? How does he kind of use an idealist cudgel to kind of keep at bay this highly mechanistic threat?
Because I think it comes back to the idea of personality and what it is to be a human being. That there is, as I say, he thinks that there is something within us which can't be explained mechanistically, which he thinks is the eternal consciousness or human nature, human spirit, and that this it's the standard. Well, he makes the same arguments, I think, that you find in anybody who wants to maintain the value of a philosophy of mind against a scientific view. This idea that there are some questions which can only be asked. To understand consciousness and agency, you have to ask philosophical questions rather than scientific ones. I think in the very general sense, that's what he's asked. That's what he's arguing, and in lots of ways, I think what he's arguing against is more important to him than what he's arguing for. In some ways, he wants to destroy this idea that even if we accept, as and he's agnostic about about evolutionary theory. But even if we accept that there is an evolutionary theory, a doctrine of hereditary, as he calls it, then we have to still ask philosophical questions about the will. And that's where he gets into this discussion about self-intervention versus personality. And then he says, well, look, if we have a personality which is ours, it's not ours, it is us. Our personality is us. And then he says, well, if we look at the world around us, how can we make sense of that claim? And that's where he's led to this idea of there being a human nature, and that human nature is the thing that is gradually being realized within us. So self-realization there has this double meaning. It is a realization of the self, but it is also a realization by the self, of itself.
Yeah, which sounds quite Aristotelian. And I suppose in some ways isn't... you could potentially give a teleological reading of evolutionary theory. Does he do that? Do they do that?
No, he doesn't. But someone like David Ritchie is far more concerned to do that. He wrote books. One was called Darwin and Hegel, in which he tries to. He's more concerned there about politics, and it's an attack on Herbert Spencer's social Darwinism. But there are other parts of Ritchie's writings where he does want to make this analogy. Well, he thinks it's more than an analogy. He thinks that he tries to meld Darwinian and Lamarckian evolutionary theory with Hegelian theories of progress, but it's generally, now I think people are very sceptical about whether this works. Certainly, I'm very sceptical about it because it seems to rely largely on a wordplay and analogies rather than actual philosophical arguments. but there are
Right.
people who try and do it. Green doesn't. And you find other things, it's interesting. You find people like Edward Caird wrote a large 2-volume book called The Evolution of Religion, which starts from, and evolution isn't used in some offhand way. He's talking about this but he's talking there about a spiritual evolution, again, trying to appeal back to Hegel. So try and make these links. And Caird generally, that becomes a recurring theme in his philosophical writings, is about this link between evolutionary theory and the development of human consciousness. So there are attempts to do this. Green himself doesn't go down that route. He just says, well, it might be true, it might not be true, but if it is true, it can answer the philosophical questions.
Yeah. Okay. Kind of like bracketing out its relevance. Because I thought I read somewhere that Green also attacks the kind of more classical physics conception of that's the whole of reality by drawing on Hume and sort of attacking the notion of causation and leveraging that to say, therefore, we need to have, he draws some idealism out of that the relations between things that we can't get must be mind supplied. That leads to his sort of entirely relational whole. I might be butchering some of this, but
yeah, I mean, he is often, people do often say that he has a solely relational view of reality, but he certainly thinks that relations are important and constitutive to reality, but there's the classic attack on that is, well, what are they relating? What is at the nodal point? And for Green, I think that's a problem if you start from what one might think of as a more analytic position. If you start from this idealist position, which is we are interpreting the world around us, how do we make sense of it? Then you already start with the matter that can form parts of these nodes, and then you start thinking about what are the relations between them. And he says, well, this is as much as we can say. We observe a world that looks like this. We can't say, and there'll be limits to what philosophy can tell us. But, if we think in these relational terms, then this is where then relations become constitutive parts of reality, but they're not the sole parts. They're not the sole constituents of reality. Now, Bradley, of course, reacts against that as well. Reacts against the sort of argument that Green has put forward by denying the reality of relations, and he does this through what he calls through what commentators calls Bradley's regress, or the chain argument, which is, as people will know, if you posit one relationship to another, then you have to posit how is that relationship established? What's the relation in the middle? It becomes then this infinite regress where you're always looking for the next relation. And once you get into that, then relations start to disappear, or the theory starts to fall apart.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we'll talk about Bradley, I think, on the next one. But I thought that the part of Green's move was, well, causal relations, Hume has shown, are not given. They're not necessarily out there, but they're the way in which we synthesize or make sense of the world around us by kind of projecting these causal relations onto it. In which case, causation sort of is itself is mind dependent and relies on a mind. So you can't have a purely mechanistic world without a mind because the mechanism has to come forth. And so that would be kind of the basis of his idealism, looking at, and I don't know if this is drawn from his Kantian reading of things, but the idea that the mechanism has to already presuppose kind of a mind, and so that's so it kind of comes back to idealism, and that then gives him the space to have a spiritual principle as well.
Yeah. And throughout, what he says is, it's reality for us. And that phrase, the for usness of it, is there throughout. So that's why this form of idealism anyway, doesn't talk in ontological terms. You know, it doesn't have that. It's far more about. There are people who've given, like Maria de Moby-Cookson, who's given it a phenomenological reading, for example. I think there are problems with that, but you know, there are people who've done that. But it's definitely from that end rather than from an ontological point of view.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So it's the method is you're starting with reality for us. You already have then that sort of viewpoint built into it. So the move then seems to me something like, when we recognize an idealist starting point, even for our mechanistic conception of the world, that gives us space to talk about there being more than the mechanistic reality. That gives space for things like consciousness and free will, which then become the foundations of ethics. So then the ethical considerations can be sort of based on a different aspect of reality than the mechanistic ones. And so that would be the way in which, I suppose, his ethics and then his later political views on, or maybe not later, but his ethical and political views sort of rely on this something like an idealist assumption.
Yeah, I mean, there was a turn in the study of all of the idealists, including Hegel, of course, in the 80s and 90s, where they tried to develop a non-metaphysical reading. So there are people who think, you know, and serious scholars who think that that is a possible reading. And I think things are lost if one tries to exclude it. And the reason for the attraction of that was that it excluded the controversial parts around the eternal consciousness, and that all of that question about, you know, is the eternal consciousness an agent that drives us, or are we responsible beings? Because if we're driven by an external entity, then what happens to moral responsibility? You know, that's the argument that comes from from those people who wanted to, I think, turn away from the metaphysical reading. But I think if you read the meta to the extent that is, you know, when one talks about these eternal consciousness, if you understand it as a teleological principle that drives human beings forwards, then it solves a lot of the problems. And that's certainly the sort of thing that you find in Bosanquet Gifford lectures that he writes and that he publishes in 1912 and 1913. He talks as that we're driven by what he calls this nisus to a whole, this drive that we have to try and attain a whole, and that is the essence of being a human being. And I think, you know, that fits with this understanding of the eternal consciousness. And as you say, as a move then to the ethics, because he frames his ethics as a form of teleology, and he has this teleological conception of human nature in relation to acquiring knowledge about the world and informing a will, then I think that's why he thinks that these things flow into one another quite easily.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there. I think we covered. I just looked through the other questions on green. I think we covered pretty much the territory. We didn't talk quite so much about the spiritual principle. We maybe came up a few times, but that's great. That's been really helpful for me and hopefully for everyone listening. Colin, is there anything you wanted to sort of add before we?
No, I don't think. You know, the only thing, you know, of course, as you say, this idea of the spiritual principle or the eternal consciousness, which is, you know, the same thing, but you know, it's a much debated topic within the literature, and there are certainly quite divergent views that people hold. I mean, maybe it's at some point in the future if we talk about Bradley and Bosanquet, we can talk about sort of similar things there and develop that. And but I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Great. So have I. And definitely we'll talk about those later, and we can, assuming people have watched this one, then we can always relate things back to Green. He was obviously the first, often considered sort of like the first founder of the British Idealist movement, isn't he? So it was good to talk about him and some of his ideas around freedom and politics and so on. So thank you very much, everybody. You can watch out, keep peeled, subscribe to the channel, and next time I get to talk to Professor Tyler, you'll know about it, and we can carry on the conversation then. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Professor Tyler.
Bye.